The room smelled like old wood and spilled beer, the kind of scent that settles into a venue over decades and never leaves. Jackson Browne sat in the back corner, his chair tilted against the wall, a worn baseball cap pulled low enough to shade his eyes from the dim overhead lights. Nobody had recognized him when he walked in, and that was exactly how he wanted it. These small shows were sacred in a way the big stages never could be. No spotlights hunting for famous faces, no expectations hanging in the air like smoke, just music, raw and unpolished, offered to whoever cared enough to listen. He'd driven nearly an hour to get here, winding through neighborhoods he didn't know, following directions scribbled on a piece of paper someone had handed him at a party 3 weeks ago. The venue was tucked between a laundromat and a Vietnamese restaurant, the kind of place you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. The marquee out front was missing half its letters. Inside, maybe 40 people scattered themselves across mismatched chairs and tables, nursing drinks, talking in low voices that barely competed with the hum of the sound system. Jackson wasn't performing tonight. He'd come because a friend of a friend had mentioned the lineup, said there were some interesting voices worth hearing, people who were doing something real in a landscape increasingly dominated by Polish production. Jackson had always been drawn to that kind of authenticity, to musicians who still believed songs could matter, who hadn't yet been worn down by the industry's machinery. So he'd driven out, found the place, paid the cover charge to a kid who looked barely old enough to drink, and settled into his corner with a glass of water. The opener had been fine, competent but unremarkable. A young woman with a clear voice and a 12-string guitar, working through a set of covers that ranged from Joni Mitchell to Tom Petty. The crowd had been respectful, attentive in that patient way audiences have when they're waiting for what comes next. Jackson had listened with half his attention, the other half wandering through his own thoughts, his own memories of nights like this when he'd been the one on stage, unknown and hungry, hoping someone in the crowd might hear something worth remembering. When the first act finished, there was polite applause, some shuffling as people got up to refill drinks or step outside for air. Jackson stayed where he was. The stage crew moved efficiently, adjusting microphone stands, checking connections, their movements practiced and economical. The room buzzed with low conversation, fragments of sentences floating past Jackson's corner. Someone was talking about a recording session that had gone badly. Someone else was complaining about rent. Normal talk, musician talk, the kind of conversation that had been happening in rooms like this for as long as rooms like this had existed. Then the second performer walked onto the stage, and Jackson felt his body straighten slightly in recognition. David Kelly. They'd met years ago, maybe 8 or 9 years back, at a party in Laurel Canyon during that brief window when the canyon had felt like the center of something important again. It had been one of those warm California nights where everyone ended up outside, sitting on decks and in gardens, guitars being passed around, songs emerging spontaneously from the clusters of conversation. Jackson remembered talking with David about songwriting, about the difference between clever and true, about how hard it was to write something that didn't try too hard. They'd gotten along well enough. Not close friends, but friendly. The kind of relationship built on mutual respect and a shared understanding of what it meant to care about craft. David looked different now. Thinner, more weathered. His hair had gone mostly gray and hung past his shoulders. He wore a faded denim shirt and jeans that had seen better days. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd spent too many years on the road, too many nights sleeping in the wrong beds. But when he picked up his guitar and adjusted the microphone, there was still that same intensity Jackson remembered, that focus that separated people who were serious about music from people who just liked the idea of it. David spoke into the microphone, his voice rough but warm. "Thanks for being here tonight," he said. This next song is one that's been living in my head for a long time. I finally figured out what it wanted to be, what it was trying to tell me, so I'm going to share it with you now, and I hope it means something to you the way it's come to mean something to me. The room settled into silence. Someone coughed. A glass clinked against a table. David began to play. The first chord hit Jackson like a physical thing. He knew it immediately, knew it in his bones, in the muscle memory of 10,000 repetitions. It was his song. The progression, the rhythm, the way the notes moved from one to the next, building towards something that felt both inevitable and surprising. He'd written this almost a decade ago, holed up in a rented house near Zuma Beach, the windows open to let in the sound of the ocean, the salt air, the sense of space that sometimes made it easier to hear what a song was trying to become. It had taken him weeks to finish. The melody had come relatively quickly, but the lyrics had been brutal. He'd filled notebooks with false starts, lines that sounded good but meant nothing, images that were pretty but hollow. He'd been going through something complicated at the time, something he didn't fully understand himself, a kind of slow unraveling of a relationship that had once felt like the most solid thing in his life. The song had been his way of trying to make sense of that dissolution, that peculiar grief that comes not from dramatic endings but from the gradual realization that someone you love has become someone you no longer recognize. When he'd finally gotten the lyrics right, when every line felt true and necessary, he'd recorded it with a producer who understood the importance of restraint. They'd kept the arrangement spare, just guitar and voice and the barest suggestion of other instruments underneath. The song had done well, had connected with people in a way that still surprised him. He'd gotten letters, strangers approaching him after shows to tell him the song had helped them through divorces, through deaths, through their own slow unravelings. That had meant more to him than the radio play, than the critical acclaim. It had meant the song was doing what songs were supposed to do, but this version, the one David was playing now, was different. The melody was identical. The chord progression, the structure, the rise and fall from verse to chorus, all of it exactly as Jackson had written it. But the words were wrong, completely, fundamentally wrong. David had rewritten every lyric, had kept only the skeleton of the song and filled it with entirely different flesh. Jackson's song had been about loss, about the quiet acceptance of endings, about learning to live with absence. It had been full of questions without answers, full of images that suggested rather than declared. There had been a woman standing in a doorway, light behind her. There had been empty rooms and unmade beds and the particular silence that follows departure. The chorus had repeated a simple line about not knowing how to hold on and not knowing how to let go, a kind of emotional paralysis that Jackson had felt deep in his chest when he wrote it. David's version was about triumph. He sang about obstacles overcome, about proving doubters wrong, about fighting through pain to emerge stronger on the other side. The melody carried the same emotional weight Jackson had built into it, that melancholy that lived in the chord progression itself, but now that weight was being used to make a completely different statement. The restraint, the vulnerability, the unanswered questions that had been the entire point of Jackson's song were gone. This version had answers. This version knew exactly what it wanted to say and said it loudly. Jackson sat very still. He could feel his jaw tightening, could feel something cold and heavy settling in his stomach. Around him, the audience listened with rapt attention. They didn't know. They had no idea they were hearing something that had been gutted and rebuilt. To them, this was just David Kelly playing an original song, pouring himself into it with obvious sincerity. The song ended. The room erupted in warm applause. Several people stood. David smiled, nodded his thanks, adjusted his guitar strap, and moved directly into the next song without pause. Jackson noticed his hands were shaking slightly. whether from nerves or something else he couldn't tell from this distance. Jackson stayed in his seat through the rest of the set. He didn't hear much of it. His mind was too busy cycling through reactions, trying to find the right way to feel. He understood covers. He'd heard his songs interpreted 1,000 different ways, and most of the time he loved it. Music was meant to be fluid, to change shape depending on who was singing it and who was listening. He believed that deeply. But this wasn't interpretation. This was something else entirely. David hadn't brought his own perspective to Jackson's song. He'd erased Jackson's perspective and replaced it with his own while keeping all the musical architecture that made the song work. It felt like theft, but not the kind you could report. It felt like violation, but of something so intangible that trying to explain it would make him sound petty. The set ended. The crowd applauded enthusiastically. David took a small bow, thanked everyone for coming, and began breaking down his equipment. People clustered around the bar, around the merch table where David had a few CDs laid out. Gradually, the room began to empty, audience members filtering out into the night. Jackson remained in his corner, watching, thinking, feeling the weight of a decision he hadn't yet made. He could leave. He could walk out right now, drive home, forget this happened. David probably didn't even know he was here. There would be no confrontation, no uncomfortable conversation. Jackson could just absorb this privately, process it alone, and never have to deal with the messy reality of calling someone out. But something kept him in his seat. Maybe it was principle. Maybe it was anger, though anger felt too hot for what he was experiencing. Maybe it was just exhaustion with a music industry that increasingly treated songs as raw material to be mined and repurposed without regard for the people who'd created them. Jackson stood up. His legs felt stiff from sitting so long. He walked slowly toward the stage, weaving between empty tables and abandoned chairs. David was alone now, coiling cables, wiping down his guitar with a soft cloth. The stage lights had been dimmed to a sullen orange glow. The house lights were harsh and fluorescent, making everything look tired and worn. David looked up as Jackson approached. There was a moment of non-recognition, then his face changed. Surprise, then something that might have been pleasure, then something that looked a lot like dread. "Jackson," he said. His voice was careful, guarded. "Man, I didn't know you were here." "I wasn't planning to be," Jackson said. He kept his voice neutral, calm. "Someone mentioned the show. I was free. Thought I'd check it out." David nodded too many times, like a nervous tick. He set down his guitar very carefully, as if it might break. "It's good to see you. It's been, 5 years? 6? Something like that. You look good. Still out there making music?" "I am." The small talk felt like walking on ice, each word a careful step, both of them aware of the thing they weren't talking about. David picked up a cable, started. Coiling it, put it down again without finishing. He was stalling. "So," he said finally, "what'd you think? Of the set?" Jackson didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch out, let David feel the weight of it. When he spoke, his voice was still calm, still measured. "I heard the song." David's hand stopped moving. "Yeah? The one you rewrote?" David looked down at his guitar case, at his hands, at anything but Jackson's face. "I thought you might recognize it." "I did." Another silence, longer this time. David shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The fluorescent lights hummed above them. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed. "Look, Jackson," David said, speaking quickly now, the words tumbling out like he'd been holding them back. "I didn't think you'd mind. I mean, it's not like I stole the song. I kept your melody, yeah, but I completely rewrote the lyrics. Made it about something different, something personal to me. I thought that was fair game. I thought that was how music worked. You've always said songs belong to everyone, that they should change and grow. You've said that in interviews." Jackson nodded slowly, I have said that, and I believe it. David looked up, hope flickering across his face. But that's not what you did. The hope died. David's face hardened. What do you mean? I completely rewrote the lyrics. Every single line is different. The lyrics are different, Jackson agreed, but the song isn't. The melody, the structure, the emotional architecture I built, all of that is the same. You didn't reinterpret my song. You used my song to say something I would never say. David's jaw tightened. So what? You own sadness now? You own melancholy? I needed to write something that helped me deal with my own shit, and your melody was the perfect vehicle for it. I don't see the problem. Jackson felt something flare in his chest, hot and sharp, but he kept his voice level. The problem is that you took something I built, something I spent weeks crafting, something that meant something specific, and you hollowed it out. You kept the part that makes people feel something and used it to sell a completely different message. It's just a song, Jackson. No, Jackson said quietly. It's not. David laughed, but there was no humor in it. Come on, man. Don't be precious about this. Songs are tools. We use them to say what we need to say. I needed your melody to say what I needed to say. That's how art works. That's how theft works. The word hung in the air between them, sharp and ugly. David's face flushed red. Theft? Are you serious right now? I didn't steal anything. I transformed it. I made it into something new. You made it into something easier, Jackson said. My song was about not having answers, about sitting with loss and uncertainty. That's hard. That's uncomfortable. What you wrote is a feel-good anthem about overcoming adversity. You took the emotional complexity I built into that melody and used it to make people feel triumphant instead of thoughtful. That's not transformation. That's betrayal. Betrayal? David's voice rose. We're not even close, Jackson. We met at a party almost a decade ago. We're not friends. How can I betray someone I barely know? Jackson felt something cold settle in his chest. You're right, he said quietly. We're not friends. We're not close. But I thought we had respect. I thought there was an understanding between people who do what we do, an understanding that songs matter, that they come from somewhere real, and that you don't just take someone else's work and repurpose it without asking. David shook his head, his expression a mixture of frustration and something that might have been shame. I didn't think I needed to ask. I changed the words. Legally, it's not even your song anymore. I checked. I changed enough that it's mine now. Legally, Jackson repeated. Sure. Legally, you're probably in the clear, but that's not what this is about, and you know it. David stared at him for a long moment. The anger in his face was fading, replaced by something more complicated. Hurt, maybe, or guilt. Jackson couldn't tell which. I've been struggling, David said finally, his voice quieter now. These past few years have been rough, really rough. I haven't been able to write anything good. Everything I came up with felt hollow, felt fake. But your melody, man, it spoke to me. It made me feel something, and I thought if I could just put my own words to it, if I could use it to tell my own story, maybe I could create something that mattered, something that helped me make sense of things. Jackson felt his anger soften slightly. He understood that desperation, that feeling of being creatively blocked, of reaching for anything that might break through the wall. He'd been there himself more times than he cared to remember. I get that, Jackson said, I do. But David, when you're struggling, when you need to say something, you have to find your own way to say it. You can't just borrow someone else's language and pretend it's yours. It's not pretending, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. I really felt those words. They came from a real place. I believe you, Jackson said, but they came from a real place while standing on a foundation I built, and you didn't ask if you could stand there. David looked away. His shoulders sagged. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What do you want me to do, stop playing it?" Jackson thought about that. He thought about demanding David never perform the song again, about making him promise to bury it. But that felt wrong, too. The song existed now. David had sung it into the world. Trying to unmake it would be futile. "I can't tell you what to do," Jackson said. "Legally, like you said, it's your song now. But I need you to understand what you took. Not just the melody, not just the structure. You took years of my life. You took the vulnerability I put into that song. You took the trust of everyone who connected to the original version, who found their own pain reflected in it. And you used all of that to say something that contradicts everything the song was supposed to be." David's face was pale now. "I didn't think of it that way." "I know," Jackson said. "That's the problem." They stood there in the empty venue, the fluorescent lights humming, the smell of spilled beer heavy in the air. Jackson felt exhausted, not angry anymore, just tired. Tired of having to explain why this mattered, tired of living in a world where art was treated as raw material, where meaning could be stripped away and replaced as long as the surface remained attractive. "I'm sorry," David said finally. The words sounded genuine but also helpless. "I really am. I needed something to hold on to." "Then you should have built your own ladder," Jackson said, "not taken mine and repainted it." David nodded slowly. He looked like he wanted to say something else but couldn't find the words. Jackson felt a flicker of compassion for him, for the struggle he was clearly going through, for the desperation that had driven him to do this. But compassion didn't erase what had happened. "I can't stop you from playing that version," Jackson said. "But I won't be in the audience again, and I won't call you a colleague. This is where we end, David. Whatever mutual respect we had, you spent it tonight." David's face crumpled. "Jackson, come on. Don't do this. It's just one song." "It's never just one song," Jackson said. "Not to people like us, you know that." He turned and walked toward the exit. Behind him he heard David say his name once, twice, the word floating across the empty room like a question that would never be answered. Jackson didn't turn around. He pushed through the door and stepped out into the parking lot. The night air was cool and clean. Above him, stars struggled to be seen through the urban light. Pollution. Dim pinpricks fighting against the orange glow of the city. Jackson stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the tension drain from his shoulders. His car was the only one left in the lot besides David's beat-up van. He got in, started the engine, and drove home through empty streets. The radio was off. He didn't want music right now. He just wanted silence, wanted space to think, to process, to figure out how he felt now that the confrontation was over. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel like he'd won anything. He just felt sad. Sad for David, who was clearly struggling. Sad for the friendship, however minor it had been, that had ended tonight. Sad for the song itself, which now existed in two versions that contradicted each other. When he got home, he sat in his living room without turning on the lights. The house was dark and quiet. He thought about picking up his guitar, about trying to write something that might help him make sense of this, but he didn't. He just sat there, letting the darkness settle around him. Over the following weeks, Jackson heard through the grapevine that David was still performing the rewritten version. Some people loved it. Some people felt uncomfortable about it without being able to articulate why. When friends asked Jackson about it, he simply said he'd heard it and left it at that. He didn't bash David publicly. He didn't try to sabotage his career. He just moved on, but he never forgot. Months later, Jackson played a club date in Portland. Someone in the audience requested his song, the original version. Jackson hesitated for just a moment, feeling the ghost of that night in the small venue, the ghost of the conversation that had ended a relationship. Then he nodded and began to play. He sang the lyrics exactly as he'd written them, every word in its proper place, every image chosen for its resonance and truth. The room fell silent. People listened with the kind of attention you can't fake. When he finished, the applause was warm and sustained. After the show, a young man approached him. He was maybe 25, thin and nervous, his hands fidgeting with a worn paperback. He told Jackson the song had saved his life. He'd been going through a divorce, had been contemplating ending things, and the song had helped him understand that not knowing how to move forward was okay, that sitting with pain was part of being human. He'd listened to it every day for months. It had become a lifeline. Jackson thanked him, shook his hand, felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with knowing your words had mattered to someone. He didn't mention the rewritten version. He didn't tell the story of the ended friendship. He just listened and accepted the gratitude and felt grateful in return that the song still existed in its original form, still doing what it was meant to do. Later that night, alone in his hotel room, Jackson thought about David. He wondered if the rewritten version had given him what he needed, if it had helped him through whatever darkness he'd been navigating. He hoped so. Despite everything, despite the hurt and the betrayal, he hoped David had found some peace. But he also knew that some things couldn't be undone. Some violations couldn't be forgiven, not because he didn't want to forgive, but because trust, once broken, doesn't repair itself. You can't rewrite the past any more than you can rewrite someone else's song and expect it to mean the same thing. Jackson fell asleep thinking about melodies, about how much meaning could live inside a simple progression of chords, about how music was both the most shareable art form and the most personal, about how something that belonged to everyone still had to come from somewhere specific, from someone's particular pain or joy or confusion. He dreamed of empty rooms and unanswered questions, of songs that existed in multiple forms, of words that couldn't be taken back. When he woke, sunlight was streaming through the hotel curtains, and somewhere outside someone was playing music he didn't recognize. He listened for a moment, then got up to face another day of creating things and hoping they would survive contact with the world intact.